Okay, so it's now 5:01, and we shall start then this wonderful meeting with Dr. Mark Evan Bonds, who is speaking from Chapel Hill, North Carolina. I presume, or someone around that area, because he teaches at that university. And it's a great pleasure for us all. This is an initiative taken from Diósnio Machado Neto, who invited Mr. Bond, and Brazilian Musicological Association is now involved, and I'm acting as its president for the moment. And that's why I'm playing the role of hostess to this meeting.
Pronto, Beatriz.
So we will have the following format for this live. It means that we have 5 guests, which is myself, Dr. Machado Neto, Dr. Rodolfo Coelho, Dr. Márcio Páscoa, and Dr. Mário Trilha. We have all prepared questions for Dr. Bonds, centering on his new book, The Beethoven Syndrome. And we're very glad to be able to discuss with him directly all the very intriguing questions and interesting points that he makes in his book. It's a really new release from 2020. And it's in celebration of the 250th anniversary of Beethoven's birth. And so, Dr. Bonds, I'm very glad to have you. And I will give you the word then so you can go on for your introduction. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all of you, and especially to Neto for organizing this. It was a wonderful surprise to hear from you, Neto, and I'm just very glad to reconnect with at least some of my Brazilian friends. As I was saying before we began, I have very, very fond memories of my visits there in 2010 and 2012, which is now a long time ago. And my visa's expired, but I would always be happy to come visit again if this crazy pandemic ever passes, I hope. So I'm also very glad that my book has found some readership in Brazil, and I'd be happy to answer the questions that I was sent in advance, and also perhaps if we have time, some further questions that come up. Before we start, I'd just like to say a couple of words about how I came to write this book. I was telling Pablo before we began that I had a long conversation with him when I was there in 2012, and it was just the tiniest idea I had for this book. And it was really different from what eventually came out, but he was one of the first to hear about it. So in a way, this book was born in Brazil. And that was the first time I'd talked to anybody really about it. It was just beginning to formulate in my mind. So it's very appropriate that we're talking about it here with the Brazilian Society for Musicology. So just a quick word on that background.
Name each family member, all right, and then we go on. Right?
I'm getting something in my earpiece.
We have Joyce, Jonathan, and...
Can everyone hear me all right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I long time ago, gosh, back in the 90s, mid 90s, I wrote an essay in Journal of Musicology on Hector Berlioz's Harold en Italie for viola and orchestra, and looked at that as a reinterpretation, or as really a misreading of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, because at the beginning of the finale, Berlioz reviews each of the themes from the previous 3 movements and rejects them, and then goes on with the finale. It's a very obvious reference to Beethoven's Ninth. And the typical interpretation of that piece is that it's related to Berlioz's time in Rome. He won the Prix de Rome in Paris and spent a year in Paris, and was, of course, obsessed with Beethoven's Ninth. And so people inevitably interpreted this piece as autobiography. And I just assumed that that was already a tradition then. And so I went to look in the Beethoven literature about people interpreting Beethoven's music as autobiography. And I found nothing, almost nothing, just a very few references in the last year or so of his life, but that was it. Nothing more than that. And I began to realize that there was a discrepancy between the reception of Beethoven's music during his lifetime and then after his lifetime. They were really two different things. And so I filed that away in my mind. As I say, this is in the 90s, and then eventually came back to it and discovered, in fact, that people did not hear Beethoven's music as autobiographical in his time, only later, only after his time. And I'm kind of surprised. I think people hadn't really made that connection before, because people who work on Beethoven tend to work on Beethoven during his lifetime, and people who work on reception tend to work on Beethoven after his lifetime. So I feel as if I connected those two, but there are also broader implications for all composers, including Berlioz, Schumann, and on. We can talk about those. But that's a little background on how I got the idea for the book. So I'd be happy to answer questions, or would you like me to go through the ones that were sent? And does everybody have those, or how does that work?
Neto, do you have an idea how you would like to do it?
Yes, eu imagino que ele pode discorrer mais se ele quiser, mas a gente já pode também entrar nas questões já.
Ele perguntou se ele vai ler a pergunta, se a gente vai ler a pergunta.
Nós vamos ler, a gente pode ler, mas ele também pode ler as perguntas também, fica mais simpático.
Tá.
Não, eu acho que seria bom cada um ler a sua pergunta.
Tá joia, então eu vou pôr as perguntas, não é? E aí cada um lê a sua pergunta.
Oh, good. Okay. So some people are reading this now for the first time, I take it?
Beatriz, você pode ler a sua pergunta? Beatriz? Oi, Beatriz. Beatriz?
Hello?
Yes.
Yes, hello?
Você pode ler a sua pergunta, Beatriz?
Yeah, I'm just explaining to Dr. Bonds that we are going to, each of us is going to read our own questions.
Okay.
So I wrote this down as my first ideas on your book, that you characterized your book as a history of listening, and we may add from a 21st century perspective. You just talked about that actually when you explained Berlioz, so I was thinking you're already answering my questions. Thus, we may also suppose that a wide variety of listeners existed and that critics were influencing a particular, albeit widening group of music consumers. Could we then infer that the interest for a composer's biographical data was, in a sense, a gimmick, a kind of gimmick towards making this audience broader, since biographical data without music knowledge or the communication codes that correspond to that music have limited meaning to music comprehension? In which level may we be referring to when we speak of music comprehension? And since your third phase includes music since 1920, which would be the state of art for abstract music, especially dodecaphonism, serialism, electronic, or even spectral music, some of which is conceived as with an absence of content, very abstract. So do you think that the Stravinsky melodic rhythmic perspective also eases this musical comprehension? And I just made that last question because in Latin American music, I have a lot of experience with composers, and they always say that after the overwhelming domination and absorption of dodecaphonism, many Latin American composers, they opted for the sort of the Stravinsky venue. So what do you think about these observations? What could you say about this?
I think these are very insightful observations, my basic answer would be yes. And I love the word gimmick. The idea that a piece of music is an outpouring of a composer's life really is a gimmick. It's a trick. It's a hook, as we might say. That's what an advertiser would call it. And it is a way of expanding the listener base. You're absolutely right about that. Some composers, I think it's interesting that Beethoven himself did not promote that way of listening to his music. He was very reticent to talk about his own music with others. And, you know, at best we have reports from Schindler, which are not very reliable. But he, unlike Berlioz was a real self-promoter. Schumann also, same thing. And interestingly, Berlioz and Schumann are both critics as well as composers. They write a lot of criticism, as does Wagner and Liszt. That whole generation of composers, all born within 10 years of each other in the early 19th century. Your point about 1920 is also very well taken because what happens around that time, say 1910 to 1920, is not simply the death in quotation marks of tonality, but also the death of program music. Program music declines in prestige very rapidly in the 1910s. So that all these composers who were writing programmatic pieces, say around 1900, they're not writing them around 1920 or so. Stravinsky is a good example. And the ideology of absolute music takes over really at that point. That's my previous book. That's the one I was actually finishing when last time I was there in Brazil, Stravinsky is writing criticism that if you didn't know who had written it, you could think it was Edward Hanslick. I mean, it is just almost word for word Hanslick's idea of pure music, as he called it. So the idea of absolute music is one that does not encourage a connection to anything at all, including a composer's life. And I think for that reason, many composers distanced themselves from the idea that their music is autobiographical. There's still, as I talk about at the end of the book, there's still this kind of ambivalence. Some composers make hints in that direction, but never really come out and do it in the old-fashioned way like Berlioz.
Okay, thank you. I don't have too many comments because I think that what intrigued me a lot was your compositional self. And I said to Neto, I still have a lot of questions, but he said, if we have time, we can talk about that. So I think for now, maybe we should just pass on to the next. And if we have time, I would like very much to go back to the compositional self, because I guess that's what is really at the center of your book in a way, right?
Okay, I hope we have time.
Neto,
yeah.
Yeah, we do too. I do too. Neto, would you like to read your question?
Yes. Dear Professor Bonds, it's a great pleasure to welcome you again with us. My question goes in the direction of your statement. The expression paradigms and the listing structures presented here were neither monolithic nor mutuality exclusive. I ask, didn't the musical agency of composer and critics depend too on the hierarchies and the hegemonies of the social class that emerged in the great centers at the end of the old regime? In other words, is the stratification of social classes caused by the advance of economic liberalism a factor in the change of the listing paradigm? mainly with regard to the decline in listening by rhetorical patterns?
Yeah, an excellent question. And this, in fact, is at the center of my next book. You anticipated it. I'm really interested in this idea of the history of listening, which is so difficult to recreate. But in a nutshell, and I'll keep my answer brief, yes, you're absolutely right that this is connected to class distinctions and hierarchies. And also the commercialization of the orchestral industry. We're talking primarily about instrumental music here. This will come up in a later question. But this is the time when civic orchestras are beginning to be founded. Vienna, surprisingly late. Vienna is 1842. New York City, the New York Philharmonic is 1842. It's very odd to think that those two cities would have established civic orchestras in the same year, but they did. And so the challenge was to grow the listener base, and this was a way of doing it. And I think critics like Hanslick, who was first and foremost a journalist critic, were doing that and conveying the idea that you really had to know how to listen. This is a question that this was a problem no one had before the 19th century. There are no music appreciation books until the 19th century. And then you get things like Fétis, La musique mise à portée de tout le monde, or something like that, that this is how you listen. And then later, Kretschmer, Führer durch den Konzertsaal. So yeah, it's an attempt to. There is a connection between one's understanding of music and one's social class. It's expected that you have some basic knowledge of music, maybe not even perform it, but that you be able to talk about it in polite society. But yeah, it's a very important angle, and I'm glad you raised that.
Okay. Neto, would you like to say something?
I think it's...
O microfone, Neto.
Yeah.
O microfone, Neto.
Então, Beatriz, thank you, Professor Bondes. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So shall we go on for the next?
Posso pedir para deixarem
again,
as perguntas? Desculpa, Beatriz. Posso pedir para deixarem as perguntas durante as respostas dele?
Ah, tudo bem. Eu deixo sim. É que eu queria ver a pessoa. Tá, obrigado, Pablo. Vou deixar.
So now we have Professor Rodolfo Coelho. Professor? Is Rodolfo there? Oh, yes,
Rodolfo?
he is.
Sorry.
So Rodolfo?
Okay. I was putting the microphone and the video again. Okay. So my question, in a nutshell, is about Bauhaus. When I was reading your book, I don't know why I had a memory of the book of Bauhaus about the music of the 19th century, and you wrote that Marx, reviewing 1825 of a performance of Beethoven's choral fantasy, Opus 80, is couched squarely within the framework of hermeneutics. So Marx was reviewing already in this idea of hermeneutics. And during the 19th century, assertions of subjectivity in musical composition were considered commonplace. But Bauhaus claims that analysis and hermeneutics arose simultaneously, but as opposite ways of unraveling the difficulties posed by the reception of Beethoven. It's no coincidence that all analytical methods from Marx to Riemann took their examples from Beethoven. And considering the Italian opera, that's the Bauhaus thesis, considering the Italian opera and the German symphony of the 19th century, isn't true that both used to claim the composer's self-expression as the source of originality, but only the second genre thrived upon the analytical endeavor to make the absolute music the winner paradigm for the 20th century. That's your last book. Therefore, what's the role of hermeneutic mind frame today? Or in other words, why did you wrote this book?
Yeah, another great question. Looking at your middle paragraph, I agree with what Dalhaus says in the first sentence, but I don't think it follows that the second sentence does not follow from that. Beethoven was the major figure. Who else would Marx, I mean, and Marx worshipped Beethoven, but who else would he have gone to for examples? Mozart and Haydn were, I think, simply too far back. So I'm not sure I understand what Dalhaus is saying with that last sentence. Maybe you have some insight there. But to go to your question, yeah, this is Dalhaus's thesis that it's the world of Beethoven and Rossini. Those are the two poles of the 19th century. This idea of self-expression, I think it really never penetrated operatic criticism, as far as I can tell. And I would be delighted to hear counter examples of that. But the most I could find would be things like particular themes appealing to composers, say, you know, the connection of Traviata with Verdi's lifetime is often made, you know, the similarities of his relationship with women, or Nabucco, the whole idea of Italian nationalism. That's fine, but somebody else wrote those texts. It was a different person who wrote the texts. And what do we do with things like Don Carlo and Un Ballo and Mascara and so on and so on? It's very difficult to make a case for self-expression there. Originality, yes, but not so much self-expression. So I think what struck me working on this book was the really distinct difference between criticism of instrumental music and criticism of opera. They're really almost two different worlds. And instrumental music is much more difficult to talk about. I mean, opera, or song, or any vocal work, you've got a text, obviously. You've got a text, and that's your hook. That's your point of departure. The music is a projection of the text. So really the only opera composer that we could talk about self-expression perhaps would be Wagner, since he did write his own texts. And plenty of people have done that as well, but he's really the exception and not the rule.
So, in a personal level, why did you wrote this book? What's the reason that you became interested in self-expression? As before, you were working in just the opposite, the idea of...
Yeah. Well, that's the answer. I was working on a book on absolute music, and you know, in the process, I was also seeing the other side of the coin. The people who were opposed to the idea. I've done quite a bit of work on Hanslick, and there are a lot of problems with his theories about pure music, as he called it. And I began to see the fault line in his argumentation, and that's really where it started. Yeah, it came out of the previous book. And the next book comes out of this one. So it's just kind of leapfrog.
Okay. Very good, very good. And I would like to also that you comment the idea that hermeneutics is in a revival process. I thought that that would be the reason for you to write the book, that you sensed an interest in reviving the idea of hermeneutics. You mentioned, for instance, Coriolanus' position and other composers. Do you think that's a defensible point of view today?
Now, when you say hermeneutics, do you mean the idea of assigning
self-expression?
Oh,
Self-expression, okay. And you can listen to the symphony of Coriolanus and think about the AIDS epidemic or something like that. You know, that's things that are not abstract. You know, so
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, I always say there's no wrong way of listening. There are just different ways. I think, yes, there is a revived interest in that, but it's really always been there. I mean, you can go back to Schering in the early 20th century, and he had these elaborate, you know about these elaborate programs he wrote for Beethoven string quartets and so on. Yeah, that's very true. I can't say that was a point of departure for me, though.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I did enough provoking.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So shall we go on? I would like to introduce you to Dr. Márcio Páscoa from the State University of the Amazonas. So Dr. Páscoa, could you please read your question?
Thanks, Beatriz. Thank you, Mr. Bones, for this conversation. Reading your book, I remembered another book by Umberto Eco, The Infinity of Lists. I suppose it is the title translated to English, no? As you suggest, audience tend to consume lives of composers and performers, not only works. From recent times to here, we purchased box sets or downloads from these pages containing the box sets with dozens of CDs fitting the whole production of one composer, of many composers, of a compositional school, thousands of rock bands, etc. Nowadays, we discard the disc and we set podcasts, more gigantic lists of music, huge selections of many people and many music from different moments in histories. Easy to do via Spotify and similar engines and apps. It decontextualizes ancient hearings and respective purposes because you can't control the reception conditions imagined to this hearing moment. We make new and vertiginous lists fastly, individualizing this procedure, and a kind of chaotic reception seems to rule over the artwork. How will can survive the artwork, its intrinsic messages, once fought to different conditions? And what about new or non-canonic composers from different times and places, from other epistemologies and traditions to these days, once we promote a planification of hearing?
Those are wonderful questions. I hope you have an answer. It would do all of us good because it is a challenge. And I think in the first part of your question, you're really going to the heart of the issue of recordings as opposed to live performance. I think it's very difficult for us to imagine a time before recordings. I mean, we can imagine it, but we can't listen that way anymore. I think even if we're hearing something live, we have this possibility in our heads that, well, I can listen to that again in a recorded form. And I think that really changes the way we listen live. And I have a sense that in the pre-recording age, I think people listen differently, and this is something I want to get at in my next book. I think they listened differently and in a way more attentively. I'm not quite sure how to articulate that yet, but it's an important point. Yeah, how can we recover those artworks? I guess trying to imagine ourselves backwards in time, but we can't unhear Stravinsky and Schoenberg and everybody else when we go back and listen to Haydn and Mozart. You know, we can try, we can make an effort, but we can't really do it. So I don't know. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Possibilities?
Mm-hmm. We can promote some dialogues to making point in a pair of composers, comparing works, comparing lives, comparing whole production too, and it was not possible in yesterday times. No. Mm-hmm. You think it's interesting?
Do you mean a contemporary composer with an older one, or
whole composers?
Like, for example,
Beethoven with Verdi, Schoenberg with Villa-Lobos, etc. Mm-hmm. Searching for similarities and discrepancies too.
Yeah, sure. That's, yeah, I think that's a very good way of.
It's more easy now than before.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, we have so much more at our disposal now, and we can think of those things. I think, yeah, and there's another, comparisons are good because it, I think, helps us realize there is no prototypical life, mm-hmm. no prototypical composer life. In a way, Beethoven is that, I think, mistaken paradigm, because his life was not mm-hmm. particularly typical. Poor Mendelssohn led a very boring life. He was very normal. He had a wife and a family, and was well balanced, and I think that's one of the reasons why he's never caught on. There's not a good story there with him. But yeah.
What I mean, I think we can appreciate different traditions now with more easily, you know. Yes.
Yeah. Because we have this perspective that's so much bigger and broader.
So, yes.
And recordings make a huge difference. So.
Okay. Thank you for your opinion.
So we now shall go on, and Dr. Mario Trilha, please, can you read us your question?
Yes, sure. First of all, I would like to thank you, sir, for this delightful conversation this afternoon, and also congratulations on your book. It was really a great pleasure to read it.
Thank you.
As quick as possible to understand the subject today. And my question would be, in your second chapter, when you deal with the subject humor and irony, Beethoven's Laune never seemed to turn into sarcasm. Did the sentiment was considered too low to be into great art? And also the matter of the coda in the third movement of the Quarteto Serioso, which has baffled many dedicated Beethovenians, could not be considered in the light of the rhetorical tradition as a peroratio with a surprise element, like when one uses a new pathos in order to create an unexpected end?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was wondering, did you have a particular rhetorical model in mind?
Yes, mostly the rhetorical model from Mattheson, from the Vollkommene Kapellmeister, when he speaks about rhetoric and he gives all the dispositio models, and one possibility from the peroratio is create a new surprise, like in a judgment when the lawyer proves that someone different is the guilty, and something new and unexpected.
And Matazan talks about that.
Yeah.
Okay, that's really interesting. I will go back and look at that, because my first book was on music and rhetoric, and I talk about Matazan at length there. But somehow I missed that. That was so long ago that I've forgotten about it.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, thank you for that suggestion. I'll certainly go back and look at it. That's definitely a possibility. It seems to me, though, that Beethoven would have been the first to do something like that on this scale. There's a little bit of that in the Mozart G minor quintet, K516, which goes to major at the end. But that's a long major section, and it's the opening theme transformed into major. What's so strange about Opus 95 of Beethoven, the Quartetto Serioso, what's so strange is that the coda has no connection to anything. Nothing at all. I mean, it's a new theme, a new tempo, a new mode. Everything is new.
Yeah, and it's not serioso at all.
No, and it's very, very short. I don't know.
Not serioso.
Well, yes and no. I have an article in the Journal of the American Musicological Society about this that goes into more detail. I mention it in the book, but if I can get your email address, I'll be happy to send you a PDF of that. Just send me an email and I'll send you a PDF.
It will be a pleasure. I would love to read it.
Yeah. Because serioso is the key word. I discovered that it can mean either, as you would guess, serious. That's sort of the surface meaning, but it can also mean overly serious, so serious that it's funny. And it's a very ambiguous word. It's a very ambiguous quartet. But that's a great suggestion. I will track that down in Matazan, because we know Beethoven read Matazan. He had that book and seems to have read it to at least some extent. So that's a very nice possibility. Thank you.
Thank you. And the matter of sarcasm, did you have some thought about it?
Well, sarcasm in music. Because my idea is that true irony and sarcasm are often used interchangeably, and that's not right. That's true irony means that opposites could be true at the same time. So we say, I don't know if you say this in Portuguese, but if somebody says so-and-so, we say, are you serious? So we don't know, is it serious or is it joking?
Yeah, we use the same. Yeah, absolutely.
Are you being ironic? The same thing. It's the simultaneous validity. Sarcasm is clearly, when you say yes, you mean no. We say yeah. So yes means no. I'm not sure how sarcasm would work in music. Could you think of an example?
Well, I think in 20th century music, for instance, in Bartók, orchestra's concert, and this when he quotes Franz Lehár and Shostakovich.
Yeah. Or Schoenberg's second quartet, the Ach du lieber Augustin. Alles ist denn. Yeah. Okay. In 20th century music, yeah, definitely. I can't think of that earlier. Mahler would have some. Anybody before Mahler? Satie, it's about the same time. But I can't think of anyone before that. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. That's something to think about. And send me your address, and I'll get that PDF to you.
Somebody mentioned Mozart's musical joke. Isn't there sarcasm there?
Yes, that's a good point. But the fact that he calls it a musical joke, I think, alerts us to that. Yes, that would be an example. but it's a little obvious because of the title.
I think Wagner did that also. In the Master Singers.
Oh yeah, okay. Yeah, that's a good point. Hadn't thought of that. That's good. Yeah, well, maybe that's another essay for somebody else. Musical sarcasm.
Yes, definitely. So shall we go on? And we have about 30 persons joining this live. And we would like now to open a bit for the other colleagues that are here that maybe would have also questions for you. So if someone wants to speak, please show yourself. Manifest yourself. Pablo.
Aldo Leone wrote a question in the chat.
Oh, in the chat, okay. Let me see. Aldo, wouldn't you like to read it?
Of course. Professor, in your opinion, does any chance of hearing perceptions of music suffer different interpretations related to different social classes in 19th century? And how the band's reductions affect that perceptions even on elite theaters?
Yeah, that's a big question. There's a very good book by James Johnson called Listening in Paris that addresses this question about social strata. And I think he has a lot to say there. There's some he has some good examples, which I'm not bringing to mind just at the moment. But yeah, this is a little related to Neto's question about social differences, but it definitely some differences there. There's a flip side to this coin, though, in that what we think of as high art was actually more accessible to lower classes in earlier times than it is now. And one example that just really floored me was I'm very interested in the American Civil War. That's just a side interest. And I'm interested in the music of the Civil War too. And there are a great many band arrangements of arias and ensembles from mostly Italian opera. There's one from Verdi's Ballo in Maschera for military band. I mean, I remember when I first heard it, I just burst out laughing. But they knew this music, as you say, through these arrangements. And so in a sense, it was closer to them than it is today, where opera is really not accessible to everyone.
Thank you.
In any form.
So is there somebody else who would like to pose a question? Pablo?
Why me? I didn't read the book.
I have another question.
But I have some comments. But I have some comments on the answerings, if you would like.
Eduardo?
But Eduardo?
Yeah, like I think I want to ask a question that is like connected to this like Brazilian audience today. It is like, how do you think that like these images of a life within music circulated around the world like after Beethoven? So like one thing is like the music circulating through scores and through performance, but how like this meaning was like attached to the music? And because I think, at least like my perception, even like in 20th century Brazil, so like we were listening to like Villa Lobos as a biographical like we're finding biographical meanings in his music. So like, how this idea, do you have any thoughts on like how it travel across, like, for example, to the US or to Brazil or other markets?
It's an interesting question. And if the book would have been even longer had I gone into that, but that question crossed my mind. And I think that gets into these issues of transnational I don't know, were you in Anna Gret's seminar on that? Were you in Anna Gret's seminar last year?
I wasn't, but I'm working with her right now on this. So. Okay.
So yeah, it's a big issue, and I think you would. There are some obvious connections. One of them would be John Sullivan Dwight in the United States in 1840s to 1870s, who was he was sort of the American A.B. Marx. And he actually translated a lot of German criticism that got published in the United States. So it would be a matter of assembling a great many of critics like that. But that's beyond the scope of what I could do. But it's an excellent question of exactly how it happened. We don't have a handle on that quite yet. We know that it happened, but exactly how is unclear. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Professor Bondes, I have another question.
Please.
I would like to ask a question outside the subject we are dealing with, but linked to the problem of musical rhetoric. I ask, what problems do you see in the research that has been established around the topics theory?
We've talked about this before. Yeah. It was a very hot topic, as we say. I'm trying to think, around 2000 to 2010, 2012. It seems to have died down lately, at least in the United States. I don't see as many people working on it. There was did you see the Oxford Handbook of Topic Theory?
Yes, Danuta Mirka and Vasily Birus, Studis, and others.
Yeah, and so that I haven't seen a lot since then. That came out what, 4 years ago, but I haven't seen much since then. I was interested in it originally and kind of distanced myself from it later. My idea of musical rhetoric has more to do with form than with syntax, really, than semantics. How about you?
Yeah, but Robert Hatton, for example, worked to musical form with topics elements. No. What do you think about this Robert Hatton theory?
Yeah. I'm not completely convinced. I'll leave it at that. It's intriguing. It's interesting, but I can't quite follow him all the way.
Rodolfo, Professor.
No, and I guess no. I'll leave it at that. Yeah. Go ahead.
As my colleague Neto raised the question, I would like to point out the difference of meaning for the word hermeneutics that the people that follow this idea of topical theory and like Hatton and others, the word hermeneutics means something quite different for them.
Yeah.
Isn't it? Because of we read those texts. Your book talking about hermeneutics in Beethoven's era, and we read Hatten talking about hermeneutics, and we may think that's the same thing, and it's not. No.
It's not,
Yes, it's not.
Can you comment that?
Yes, Rodolfo, thank you for pointing that out. To me, hermeneutics, I'm using that more in the earlier sense of the 19th century, and the very idea that a musical work could be in need of hermeneutics. That to me is really a striking moment in the history of music, in the history of listening. No one really before the 1830s or so had ever thought to think, okay, this is how you listen, this is how you understand something. Because hermeneutics is only necessary when a text poses a problem. And the idea of instrumental music being a problem was simply foreign to listeners of that time. So I think that's why it gets started. But it's a much broader understanding of the term than Hatten. You're right.
Mário, por favor.
Obrigado. Yes, Professor Bonds, I would like to comment something and ask you. It's not directly in your book, but I would like to know when Beethoven's reception in the USA turns into almost nearly a sacred figure. In Brazil, in the second half of the 19th century, Beethoven's turned into really a kind of saint. If you look at our great writer in the time, Machado de Assis, there is one novel called The Famous Man, that the guy wants to compose. He's very upset to turn into a serious composer. He's a popular music composer. He composed polkas and waltz and this kind of things, but he wants desperately to compose sonatas and quartets, serious music. And he has a kind of altar which Beethoven's emerged like a saint, you know? Yeah. And the first chamber music association in Brazil was called Club Beethoven in Rio de Janeiro. Here in Manaus, we have a beautiful opera house from the end of the 19th century. And one of the columns, it's like a temple, and one of the columns is Beethoven. You know, it's a kind of monument. And this phenomenon also occurs in the US at more or less at the same time.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. I'm thinking of Symphony Hall in Boston, where you look at the stage and in the middle, above everything, right in the middle, there's a plaque that says Beethoven. And so that's as you say, an altar. And there are many examples of that. There's a short article by Reinhold Brinkmann somewhere. I'd have to look it up, but he actually catalogs this phenomenon in the I think in Europe and the US, and shows that it was, I think, just around the same time, starting in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, in there. Yeah, it was a cult. Yeah. When you get in touch with me, send me the name of that novel. I'd be interested in knowing a little bit more about that. Yeah, thank you.
Of course, thank you.
Beatriz, existem perguntas de outros?
Yeah. There is Fernanda who would like to make a question, and also Pablo.
Fernanda,
Finally.
por favor, se apresente para nós.
Oops. Hi, everyone. My name is Fernanda Silvestrin, and my nickname is Italian. My last name is Leandro Silvestrin. I'm really happy to be here. I'm actually a student of Professor Márcio Páscoa and Professor Mario Trilha from the State University of the Amazon. I'm really excited about this topic because I'm really obsessed right now on studying Kunchu opera, which is a kind of Chinese opera. And we have a lot of this thing there about people hearing it, the lyrics of the text, and thinking that this was what they were thinking. And I think that nowadays with pop music, we kind of, we feel that, you know, the person who writes the lyrics and they are actually feeling that, and that's what they want to show.
Right.
And, you know, this poem that Professor Mario Trilha was talking about. I was going to talk about it. It's amazing. He played for us in class. And I'm really I'm feeling like this is so important for us to study a little bit of philosophy, and actually philosophy and music that I've seen you have some works on, for us to really understand what everything's about, because otherwise we start to make assumptions about whether we're feeling or whether we're interested in. And I would like for you, I don't know, to talk a little bit about this, about how we can get confused sometimes. I just bought your book on Kindle, so I haven't read it everything yet. So I would like for you, to talk to us, young people who are studying music on university, who want to write works about it. I really want to write a work about Concho opera, comparing a little bit to Italian opera. I'm thinking about it, but I really would love to do that. And it's really important for us to, keep this line between emotion and composition, I guess. I don't know if I'm expressing myself right. So I would love to hear your thoughts.
It sounds very interesting. Yeah, I would go back to something I said earlier, which is that there's no such thing as wrong listening. And I think it's important to encourage people to hear in a way that gives them pleasure and that they enjoy, but at the same time to also open up other possibilities, different ways of listening. And for me, just speaking personally, I really hear Beethoven very differently since having written this book. Because I think I have a better sense of how his contemporaries heard him. And as I said before, we can't transplant ourselves back to that time. We have too much Wagner and Schoenberg in our ears, but I think it expands our horizons. It gives us more possibilities to listen. And so I think the past is a real source of alternative ways of listening, and we don't have to follow them. We don't have to listen that way. We don't have to listen anyway, at all. The important thing is that we listen and try to make sense of it and enjoy it. That's I think really the main thing that we sometimes lose sight of.
Thank you,
Pablo.
So as I said previously, I didn't read the book, but nevertheless, in order to ensure to make a sort of coherent question, I will start with an idea that emerged through this meeting.
Mm-hmm.
Is that since Beethoven was producing music at the time that we might say producers start to detach, musical producers start to detach from simple mecenas or noble sponsoring the
patrons, yeah.
Patrons, yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
We can draw an arc to the 21st century in a sort of crescendo the development of music industry, and we might certainly quote Adorno many times as we want, and trying to connect making music, producing music, that is making available to the masses, and the music reception in its very different ways, right or wrong, whatever, apart, besides the fact that layers of knowledge about any music we listen to adds consistently deeper knowledge affecting how we listen to them.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I think what we can or might consider is that music as big data. And I use the expression big data as we use nowadays. And that's why we have Spotify and different apps and platforms that gives us music in many different ways of reception, not only acoustic, but only visual. And the visual side is increasing every day.
Right.
So am I wrong if I think about the dual relation between self-expression and self-reference in music production and music apprehension, let's say that way? But as a matter of fact, as Fernanda mentioned it, the feeling is part of the knowledge of this, of the apprehension of this big data in units called music or themes or composition or movements of larger works or scenes. And am I wrong if I consider hermeneutics more present today than in the past because of the text we produce about those musics?
It's a vicious circle.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think also, you know, this long-standing question of the difference between, for lack of better terms, classical music and popular music. I'm convinced more and more that you can't do it on the basis of style or on the basis of the work itself. It really comes down to the mode of listening. So are you listening really from your own perspective as to how do you respond to it immediately and directly, or do you think, that's invertible counterpoint, or we're in, suddenly it's 4-voice texture instead of 2-voice, things like that, you know, which is a more technical way of listening. They're both legitimate. And the question is how to reconcile them. They're not disconnected. Let me just say they are connected, but I think people tend to make divisions where it's really a very broad spectrum of how we listen.
Yeah, this is how I consider it big data.
Yeah.
As a whole, you know. But thank you for it's ideas that coming in my mind.
Yeah. Beatriz, you had a question earlier on that you said if we had time we could come back to it. It was a turn.
Yeah, just like of some comments, because I remember the book that I like very much by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, which is the Rêverie du promeneur solitaire. You probably know it very well. And it was considered at the time one of the benchmarks for this new type of literature of self-expression. So I was rummaging over my thoughts, you know, and my references. And I remembered, because it was a book that had impacted me very much, and also the paintings by Friedrich, and all these feelings that began to arise in art and in literature and everywhere, like sort of a big data, like Pablo is saying now. But and I was thinking about Les Rêveries and the time that they were written, because he was already an older man and he was retreating from the world, and he decided to do the les promenades, the ways, the walks, you know. So this way of walking through, I remembered also Duas Companhias, you know, that came about with programmatic music. So as we promenade, over our feelings, and we conquer this 19th century perspective of actually not being, how can I say, not enslaved, but enclosed into musical forms, we actually gave birth to this whole new reception perspective for hearing in different ways, not as so, let's say, mechanic or so codified. I always say to my music history students that feelings during the 18th century were like happiness or sad or this, but when you come the irony and Hoffman and all those authors that begin to conquer irony, is when we actually have complex feelings, a feeling of happy sadness or sad happiness feelings. And vice versa. Yes, exactly. And there's a book that I always tell Neto when we talk, and by Jairo Moreno, which I think is very interesting on that. You probably know it. It's called Music Representation, Subjects and Objects. Mm-hmm. The Construction of Musical Thought in Zarlino, Descartes, Rameau, and Weber. Mm-hmm. And he talks about irony, and E.T.A. Hoffman, the use of irony, how it was important for music language and for self-expression. So I was thinking if you could talk just a little bit more about the composition of self. It's something that I actually turned on some neurons, in my mind. Yeah.
This is the compositional self. Yeah, chapter 2 of the Beethoven Syndrome is about the changing conceptions of the self, and Rousseau does play a role. The whole idea of self-expression was, we just take it for granted. I mean, that's what expression is. We express ourselves, but that's a relatively recent way of thinking about expression. I was struck researching this book. I'd always been bothered by the whole theory of mimesis, that music is an imitation of the passions, or that music is an imitative art, and I couldn't square that with expression. Until I realized that they simply didn't think in those terms of self-expression. Self-expression is a new idea. It's kind of unfortunate it's the same word. It really should be something else. Portrayal, representation, as in Jairo Moreno's book, representation is expression. It's for the French in the 18th century. It was the same thing. They were synonymous. I'm not connecting with your question here.
No, you are. You're talking about the French, and I remember they have a very long tradition of mimesis, and mm-hmm. since Couperin and all those authors. So I just wanted. It was not really a question. It was more like a comment that mm-hmm. Arose to my own reading references in other realms, like in literature and so on, and how this is so interesting because you also give all the references on Goethe and the Le Jeune Werther and all those. You cite this, but you didn't cite Rousseau. And I remembered, Rousseau is very important also.
I think I got La Nouvelle Hélène in it. Yeah, but anyway, okay, yeah. No, Rousseau is very important, yeah. And the confessions are really basic. And, again, things that we just assume are perfectly normal were not back then. They were almost unimaginable. And that's the challenge of history, is to put ourselves back in that time as much as we can.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the effort of, let's say, the historical performance movement, which some of us are linked to. I think Mario and Marcio are both linked also to the hip movement, the historical informed performance.
Yeah.
And that's, I had as an advisor Dr. Neil Zaslow, and he used to
Oh,
say
yeah.
in his symposia that, yeah, and he would used to say that it's a epistemological problem because we will never get there, but we'll keep trying. You know?
Yeah, yeah.
So I don't know if there's anybody who wants to also.
Rodolfo is wanting. Rodolfo is.
Yes. One more question. It has been so long time that we don't speak. And so I'm very tempted to continue this conversation for a long time. When you, in the last chapter of your book, you mention a new paradigm of the composer as an engineer. Do you remember that? And
that's you. That's you. Yeah.
Yeah.
I had you in mind.
And you know that I teach Beethoven as somebody that behaves as an engineer.
Good, good.
Yeah. Why I do that? Because for me, it's a personal interpretation or a personal way of going into his problems. Is that each work that he writes concerns one problem. So engineer is a problem solver. Mm-hmm. And I think I imagine that every time that he starts a new composition, he sets to himself a new challenge. A new problem to solve. For instance, I remember the string quartet, the fugue, the great fugue. I think that he had the Albrecht's Berg treatise of counterpoint just in front of him. And Albrechtsberger says that nobody can use all the tricks of counterpoint in only one composition. And Beethoven say, I will do that.
I can do it, yeah.
I can do that. And that is a problem. And he does that. You know, he uses all the bag of tricks of counterpoint just in one composition. That's one example of that idea. Am I too wrong? Am I?
No, totally correct. And you know, there's no false way of hearing. There's no false way of interpreting. Some are more convinced. Some ways are more convincing than others. But most of them have some value. So I like that approach. But I thought of you when I wrote that line about the composer as engineer. So.
Oh, I would live well with that thought, Rodolfo. I would be very flattered.
Rudolph Rabbit.
So I think we don't have it.
I am very flattered. I'm very flattered.
Yeah. You deserve it. So we would like, maybe it's already 6:15. And since we don't have any more questions, I was thinking maybe you want to say some last words for us, Dr. Bond?
Just thank you again. It's been a lot of fun, and I've really enjoyed it, and it's been very stimulating. I've written down several things, and I hope to hear from some of you on this. I've got one message to respond to here. Let me do that before we close down. Okay. Yeah, as I said before, my whole way of hearing Beethoven is different. I had always, after writing this book, I had always, I began as, and still am, partial to Haydn. I mean, that's my composer. My dissertation was on Haydn. And I always wondered, why did Beethoven get all the press? And I think I kind of came up with an answer here. But in the course of working on this book, I read so much literature, and I was in Vienna for a year while I was working on it, which was a great thrill. I still, you know, when I was going from my apartment to the university, I would go right past the place where Beethoven composed the Opus 95 string quartet, and I never got used to it. It was really thrilling. But I read so much criticism of him, I began to piece together a different view of him that's really much richer than the standard scowling Beethoven, you know, with the mouth like this and the wild hair and everything. It fits certain works like the Fifth Symphony very, very well. And then other works, it just doesn't fit at all. And there's a whole slew of them. So there was a kind of a spin-off from this. I don't know if you can see it, but I've got a new book out. It's a very small book, but it's called Beethoven Variations on a Life. And it's also published by Oxford University Press. But it's written for a general audience, not musicologists. But to my amazement, it's the first short, concise book on Beethoven and his music. You would think there would be any number of them. There are all kinds of biographies, and there are new ones coming out this year. And they're all 400, 500, 600 pages. And most of them are very good, and I really benefited from them. But I kept thinking, you know, people need, the general public, concert goers, could use just a quick digest of Beethoven's music, life and music. So a lot of what's in the Beethoven Syndrome, the general idea of listening to his music fresh without the biographical connections comes through in this book, but it's something you might want to check out. So it was a lot of fun working on this book, and and it's still generating ideas. You know, this next one about an even broader history of listening. I'm still thinking about it, and some of the ideas that have come up today, I think, are ones that I'll be thinking about in the future. So again, thank you for this chance to talk with you, and it's great to see those of you I knew from before, and to meet even if only virtually new people as well. And I hope to continue our contact.
So do we, and of course we would like to thank you very, very much. And it was a pleasure for all of us. I'm sure everybody agrees, and very enriching, and maybe there will be a part 2.
Okay, I would love that. Yeah, I would enjoy that. Good to see everyone.
Okay.
Thank you.
Neto, would you like to say some last words too?
Famous final words by Neto. Se você não abre o microfone, Neto, vão ser as últimas palavras mudas.
Silenciosas.
Well, I would like to thank Professor Bondes for his immense generosity, to say that we have him in high esteem, and we hope to see him soon. Thank you, Professor Bondes. Thank you, Evan.
Thank you, Neto. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Mark. Bye-bye.
Ciao.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Ciao.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye, everyone.